It is an enormous pleasure for me to be able to introduce as our keynote speaker this morning, Macartan Humphreys from Columbia University. So Macartan is a professor of political science at Columbia, where he teaches political economy of development and also theory. You know, he's done a huge amount of research, bringing research on politics, research on economics, quantitative methods, bring it all together in an impressive body of research on post-conflict development, ethnic politics, democratic development. And of course, he is also very well known for using very creatively field experiments to illuminate issues in these areas. I could go on for much more, but he's told me that he has quite a packed presentation, so I would just want to offer the floor and just thank you very much for being here, and then we should welcome in the usual way.
Great, so it's a real pleasure to be here. I used to visit CSE every now and then when I was studying here about 20 years ago, and was very impressed by the vibrancy of the group here at that time, but it's just blown up, and it's extraordinary to see this massive concentration of papers. So everyone came because of this great title, I think. Researchers ran a big field experiment in Africa, and you won't believe what they found. So apologies for the clickbait. You know, the idea of the title is that this sort of presentation, this marketing of research matters a lot for the sort of research that gets picked up, with possibly dangerous consequences for us as a community of scholars. So in the talk today, I'm going to start with a sort of proposition, which is a very depressing proposition. I'm going to illustrate it with my own work. But the proposition is that it seems that the more carefully we work, the less interesting our findings are. Okay, that's the basic proposition. The professional and public rewards are for bold, counterintuitive, and positive results, right? Which, in other words, is kind of a professional reward for outliers, for outlier findings. Okay, and so you can stand up and say, this is going to change everything you ever thought. But when we're in a world in which results aren't replicating out of sample, or when we're making predictions about how things will work out of sample, and those fail, as we are seeing, the entire scientific community is taking a sort of reputational hit. Now, this is, it seems to me this concern, I'm sure this is different for different areas people are working in. I see it as being very strongly related to issues of effective heterogeneity and causal complexity. And these are issues, so I'm a political scientist, I work in governance issues. These are themes that loom very large in the areas that I'm working in, but likely, at least for some of you, are quite important here. So what I plan to do is I'm going to sort of outline a little bit some thoughts around the heterogeneity, causal complexity issues, and some of the risks associated with that and the way we present and sell our work. And then I'm going to describe three approaches that we've been exploring to try to address this. There are many others, but three approaches. One is what's called mechanism experiments, one is structural estimation, and one is a form of structured meta-analysis that we're trying out. And some reflections on all of those. I guess I come away with somewhat mixed feelings about all of them. So to me, this is very much a sort of a set of open questions about how to engage with this set of themes, which I think are kind of a fundamental set of themes. Okay, good. So I'm going to motivate this with a tale of 6 projects that I've been involved in with co-authors. The 6 projects are going to be 2 in the areas of political communication, 2 in the areas of community-driven reconstruction, and 2 in the areas of political accountability. And so you can guess what these graphs are going to look like. So the first study is a study, and I'll go into more detail about all of these studies during the talk, so I'll just give a very, very basic sense now. The first study was a study on political communication. I would consider it a sort of moderate credibility study. I'm not going to say low credibility study, but it was a moderate credibility study with large effects. The next one in the same area was a national policy experiment, which we think, based on the design, had strong credibility with null effects. Okay? The second set of studies is in the area of community-driven reconstruction, and there we have a sort of, we looked at a fairly weak, both these were field experiments, we looked at a fairly weak program with measures that have some concerns over the sort of external validity of the measures, sort of more lab-style measures. But we've got large and striking effects, complex effects, but striking effects. And then the second study in this area was a strong program, and we really invested a lot in getting what we thought were going to be very robust behavioral measures, and got a sea of null results sort of across the board. And so one confusing thing here for us in these two was that when I say weak program, strong program, the implementers in the study in which we found these strong effects were very surprised because they actually thought they hadn't really done such a great program in this area, and they're surprised that was the case. And they're also surprised in the place where we found the null results, because it was an area where they felt they'd really invested in a very strong program. So this disconnect between the research and the practitioners' views. And the last is political accountability, where this is in the context of the same experiment, where we did a sort of a more framed, like something's called a framed field experiment with moderate credibility but large effects, and then a much stronger national policy experiment with null effects across the board. So you're seeing this sort of downward trend in our work, and we could probably populate this with more, and it's a very, very depressing thing, because you want to be able to go out and say, you know, the more effort I put into this, the more striking and strong these results are, and now this is how you should do things. But that at least has not been my experience. Here is a sense of our publications. So APSR is a nice journal for political scientists. And so you'll see on the left one, it's the moderate large effects in the APSR, and the middle one, the moderate left is APSR. The strong one has been rejected 6 times and counting, and the other one's also been rejected. And the political accountability one, we were too depressed. It's stuck in our file drawers. We've never sent it out, right? So if you look in a way at the published record, particularly focusing on sort of the higher ranked, you know, more reputable publications, at least in our field. You're getting a complete mischaracterization of what we actually find. That's sort of internal to a particular researcher, right? So the sort of discipline level, you know, effects of this could be quite a bit stronger. Okay, so that's sort of to motivate the problem. So the issues. I was trying to think about this. I think there's 2 or 3 distinct issues here. One is heterogeneity. So we're seeing different effects in different places, which we're having a hard problem making sense of. And another is there's a sort of marketing problem, that there's a kind of a culture, and this is in the media, but it's also among reviewers and journals, of research as entertainment, you know, and that can create a disinterest in replications and in nulls. I mean, people are quite conscious of this, but you know, it's quite common for an editor to say, you know, this is too similar to a previous study, or this is replicating previous study, or very common to say there's a null result here, so we don't learn anything, right? I'd say as a footnote, a real challenge here is we actually do learn less from nulls, right? It's nice to think you learn as much no matter what you find, given the strength of the design, but sort of put it through any kind of Bayesian model, you actually do learn less from nulls. But get rid of all your nulls and you have a terrible misrepresentation of the world. Okay. So, this problem, you know, all of this work is experimental work. This problem comes in part from, there's something inherent in the way we think about field experiments that feeds into this problem. A basic issue is that when we're doing field experiments, typically, at least in our corner of the world, we're chasing after average treatment effects, right? So we sort of recognize what we call the fundamental problem of causal inference. We're not going to get unit-level causal effects, so we chase after average treatment effects. And the problem with average treatment effects, I mean, it's a remarkable thing that you can estimate unbiased average treatment effects from randomization. So it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. We shouldn't lose sight of that. But the problem is that average treatment effects don't always have a very clear economic meaning, right? And they may have a clear policy meaning, but they often don't have a very clear economic meaning for a very obvious reason. You know, that has the word average in there. And so what it is, the quantity you're getting, depends very much on what you're averaging over. And we often don't have a lot of understanding of what we're averaging over. And sometimes we choose what we're averaging over without a lot of thought. You know, so one thing that I find very striking is following Fisher, we're quite keen often on factorial designs as ways of looking at lots of interventions without losing power. It's a very nice feature of factorial designs. But when we do that and we alter the set of combinations of treatments we're looking at, we're altering what we're averaging over. So we're changing the estimand in a way that often is not really particularly meaningful. And so if, as very often the case with political interventions that have distributive consequences and have risk of backlash and so on, if you're in a world in which ex ante you think there's some conditions in which you might have positive effects, some conditions in which you might have negative effects, and some conditions in which you don't really expect any effects at all, you learn really almost nothing from a single study that estimates either a positive effect or a negative effect or no effect. It's going to do one of those three things. You know, each of those three things are possible, unless you've got some structure to interpret that result in the context of other contexts. So that's okay. There are two ironies here. Okay, one is an irony on method. The beautiful thing about field experimentation or experimentation is that you can use design-based inference. Right? So when you're estimating effects, when you're estimating your p-values, you can use randomization inference. When you're estimating your standard error, you can do name and standard errors. You can drop the models, basically. You can rely on what you know, which is the assignment procedure, in order to get your estimates. That's a wonderful thing. In a way, it makes you much more credible, right? Because you're putting in fewer assumptions, right? You're not model dependent. The irony is, and it really is, it took me a really long time to see this, the irony is what you actually want to learn about is the model, right? What you care about is your model of the world. At the end of the day, when you learn something and you go and communicate with someone else about what's going to happen somewhere else in the world, what you're transporting is your understanding of how things are working. So you really want to understand the model in some way, unless you really have a lot of conviction about causal homogeneity. Okay. So we need some sort of way to kind of preserve the benefits of weak model reliance in order to get our estimates, but keep the goal of learning about models. The second irony, it took me a while to see this, but at least in political science, there's quite an embrace of working with development actors to do field experimentation, partly driven by the fact that researchers want to have an impact on the world. They want to do something that's meaningful and important. They're very conscious of the causal complexity and the difficulty of getting sort of a universal result of some form. But when they partner with groups that want to understand, does this program work? You know, sort of what works. You know, there's a lot of this. It seems to provide an answerable question that doesn't require an understanding, a deep theoretical understanding. And people often don't say it exactly like this, but this is an attractive feature of this. You can answer the question, you know, does this intervention have this outcome? Sort of. You can half answer it, right? The irony is when people started bringing back the results, the questions they were getting were not so much about, is it really true that this effect took place in this area, but what's the effect going to be in the next place, right? Or what's the effect going to be with a different intervention, right? In other words, the researchers who had done these nice, you know, experiments, design-based inference, you know, no claims about a model, were being pushed by practitioners to answer the social scientific questions that should have been the target in the first place, but had been let go of, right? So that's an irony and I think a mistake. Okay, so this heterogeneity. It really is a fundamental problem. And so what I mean, in the same way as the fundamental problem of causal inference is a fundamental problem. So I'm going to just one or two slides on this and why we have to sort of think hard to try and address it. But recognizing that we won't fundamentally address it. We want to understand how things happen. We don't have great strategies for this. So here's the problem. Imagine you're in a world in which you're thinking X causes Y, right? So some intervention causes some outcome. And you want to understand, was it through this particular mechanism, right? So X could cause M and M could cause Y, okay? But if you've got heterogeneity, which here is represented by the idea you've got two subpopulations in this example. In one of those subpopulations, X is causing M, but M is not causing Y, right? In the other subpopulation, X is not causing M, but M is causing Y, right? And if you work really hard and get lots of funding and set up two separate experiments, one is to figure out what is the average effect of X on M, and the other to figure out what is the average effect of M on Y, in the same population, you could come out with the answer that X causes M and M causes Y, and you might also have the answer that X causes Y on average, right? And you think, I've got an understanding of the mechanism that's supported by experimentation, sort of gold standard. But in fact, you can see there's not a single person in this population for whom X causes Y through M, right? You're just completely wrong because you're misunderstanding this heterogeneity, which is working through distinct sets of mechanisms. This problem's been recognized for a long time. Here's a formulation from Pearl. So Pearl and others have been doing some beautiful work on causal inference for the past 40 or 50 years, which has largely been ignored by political scientists and economists, but I think it could be very fruitful in addressing these problems going forward. But as expressed by Pearl, you're often interested in understanding the indirect effects of a treatment. Okay? So using potential outcomes notation, which maybe Pearl wouldn't like, but using potential outcomes notation, that's defined here as what's the outcome you would get if you fix X at a particular level and change the mediator to the value that it would have if X changed. Right? So you're keeping your treatment fixed, and the counterfactual you're imagining is how the outcome is different when the mediator changes the way it would change if X changed. Right? That's the quantity. It's a well-defined causal quantity. Right? The problem is this well-defined kind of basic quantity in the understanding of mechanisms cannot be assessed with any experiment. Right? There's no experiment you can do to assess this because it requires that you manipulate some value to a level it takes that you don't know what that level should be. You can only learn what that level should be if you have a separate experiment. But once you have a separate experiment, you've changed the situation. So there's a set of assumptions under which this is possible. They're quite strong assumptions, but it's a fundamental problem. You cannot use experimentation to identify the indirect effect. Okay. So that's our problem, or that's one of the problems, and we have to take this head on. And my sense is the changing environment, and makes this in a way more crucial. So, what's the changing environment? We're facing risks of misuse of research. Okay, so when you've got a lot of heterogeneity and confusion about mechanisms, there's two ways in which research can be misused, and we've seen a lot of these. One is that you have different results from different studies, and people can, even if they're all published, motivated actors can fish among the studies. Right? So we've become quite conscious about the problem of data fishing within a particular study, but you can also fish between studies. The story in climate science actually shows how extraordinarily severe this risk can be. So you can have 99% of scientists in an area making one claim, and one person who's making an opposite claim. So a Princeton physicist, says this is a load of rubbish, and it can make headlines. So with the existence of this heterogeneity, there's a real risk. Fishing between interpretations is a risk when there's multiple mechanisms that can give rise to a given outcome. So a small illustration of this, we did one intervention where we looked at the effects of a community-driven reconstruction program on ex-combatant acceptance in villages. Right? So there was an aid program, and we looked to see how that affected ex-combatants in villages. And what we found was that there was a decrease in acceptance of ex-combatants, not an increase. Right? We were expecting and hoping for an increase, and there was a decrease. And we sent this off to our partners, who were quiet, for 24 hours, and then came back and said, "This is great news, because this shows that the effect of the program means that communities are more willing to stand up to the ex-combatants." Right? And sort of reinterpreted what could be possibly going on here to get sort of nice results. This seems to be a kind of a perennial risk if you don't have this understanding of structure and mechanism nailed down. Okay. So the last point here is what's also changing is there's competition. Okay, so I'm not sure if there ever was a time, but it certainly felt there was a time where academic researchers had something of a monopoly on research of this form. But this is really not true anymore. Lots of people have got access to data. Lots of people are very skilled: journalists, think tanks, lobbyist firms, and some of them being motivated actors. Right? So as academics, if we want to have an impact in this debate, we need something that sort of sets the work apart. And the key thing, I think, is reputation. So one conclusion I take from this is that the kind of classic peer-reviewed sort of approach to publication, if anything to me, seems to be more important now. rather than less important. I know people are thinking of all sorts of different models, but maintaining that reputation seems extremely important. And I have a lot of worries and concerns. I'd like to hear people's thoughts on it, but on the role for blogs, in discussing this, engaging with research, where you often have very unfiltered discussion of research, drawing in much more people often, but without often the same level of quality assurance. Okay, so we face a particular problem if academic efforts to make research more reliable are going to make it more irrelevant. Need to turn that around. So very quickly on three possible solutions. I'm going to go back to these projects that I outlined at the outset. Okay? The solutions we're going to look at are the mechanism experiment, the structural estimation, and meta-analysis. And I also want to highlight, in all of these, we're trying to bring also a very high level of transparency to the research. So there's sort of this pre-registration going on with all of these studies. Pre-registration actually is pretty much a norm in field experimental research and political science. And I know it's quite strong in many areas in economics as well. But it seems to be extremely important. We can talk about that also. Okay, so political communication. We did a set of studies that was trying to look at what is the effect of access of citizens to politicians through SMS messaging or other channels on things like on who participates in politics, but also the responses of politicians, empowerment, and these kinds of questions. In a controlled setting, so a controlled setting where sort of one-on-one we provided people with access to this communication, we found that we were able to turn around basically the relationship between marginalization and access to politicians. Right? So we found that more marginalized people were using this communication at a higher rate, and were actually less sensitive to price than less marginalized people. Which was a turnaround and good news. We scaled up this intervention with the Parliament of Uganda, and so the Parliament of Uganda put in place an SMS system sort of on their website, housed in Parliament, in which they, over the course of 6 months, they advertised this every day in 19 languages. Contact your MP, engage with your MP about the issues that you have, and so on. With the biggest fear they had was that this was going to cost too much because of the millions of phone calls that were going to come in. And with this national level policy experiment, over the course of this period, there was only a trickling of messages, so very, very little engagement, right? Orders of magnitude smaller than what was expected from the more controlled experiment. And perhaps more depressingly, there was no flattening. So what we were seeing is, if you compare, say, the gender, in the controlled experiment, similar uptake among men and women. In the actual national field experiment, it's men taking part, right? In terms of wealth, it was poorer people disproportionately in the control experiment. In the national scale-up experiment, it was wealthier people taking part, and so on, right? So the predictions of what was happening from the control experiment were sort of completely off when it moved up to the national experiment. So one thing we wondered about was, a few things differ between the controlled experiment and the national experiment, right? One thing that differs is that when you have a controlled experiment, you engage with people directly, you have a sort of invitational effect. You're sort of directly inviting people to take part in politics. It's a recognition of their voice, and that could have a stronger effect for more marginalized populations. That was the idea. Okay? So the approach that people suggest in this situation is, well, do another experiment. Right? So do a mechanism experiment specifically to target that mechanism and see if that matters. Okay? So we tried that out. In the mechanism experiment, we provided an invitation to a set of people. We had actually multiple invitations. Your MP wants to hear from you, and so on. And what we saw was that those looked like small numbers, but 2% is actually relatively large in this area of engagement with politicians. We saw that invitations do get people more likely to engage in this sort of political communication, but there's no evidence that this was contributing to the differences in flattening. Okay, so we came away from this mechanism experiment feeling, well, we think we learned something, but we have continued worries about inference. The style of the mechanism experiment, we go back and try and figure out what was going on. Means that you're often looking at a different time period, sometimes with a different population, and also in the context of a different experiment. right? So those problems I showed you with those diagrams before are not addressed at all by the design of mechanism experiments, right? They're not capable of addressing those. You have to have a lot of context, a lot of confidence and homogeneity to buy this. So we came away a little less excited about mechanism experiments. Okay. This next one on structural estimation is the one I'm spending a lot of time on at the moment. And I know some people here have been doing some work on structural estimation, so be interested in hearing views on this. We did an intervention, we looked at an intervention in Liberia in which there was a community-driven reconstruction in 83 villages. So in some of those areas there was an aid project that engaged the community, and in some areas there was not. And the question of interest was whether that increases community cohesion, right, which can be measured here as the ability of the community to solve a collective actions problem. Okay, so we're measuring it using a sort of a lab-style prisoner's dilemma type experiment. One thing we did was when we went to look at the effects of the intervention using this public goods experiment, was we varied who was playing the public goods game. So in half the areas it was 12 men and 12 women playing, and half the areas it was 24 women playing. So we varied the composition, which lets us address this question of how does group composition matter for behavior in these games. And the results here are really, really, I think, really striking. So what we found is that in the control areas where there's no intervention, there's this huge effect of the gender homogeneity intervention variation. So women were much more likely to contribute when they're playing with other women than when they're playing with other men. Okay, that's a very strong effect. Okay, in those, so that's going across the top row here. In those areas in which it was mixed genders playing, there was a very strong effect of the CDR intervention, right, of the community-driven reconstruction intervention. So in those areas in which there was community-driven reconstruction, communities were much more likely to solve this collective action problem. But there's this big, massive negative interaction. So in other words, the CDR, we have strong evidence for the CDR intervention working when we look at play in mixed groups, right, and no evidence for the CDR intervention working when we look at play in homogeneous groups. So it's sort of puzzling. So as it turns out, going back to average effects, the average effects of the CDR intervention are positive and significant, right? So we can come away feeling we have a, there's not a multiple comparisons problem here, right? We have an answer to that question. But it means we've got sort of a menu of conclusions, right? We could come along and instead of saying this is average effects over two treatment arms, what we really have here is two very distinct ways of measuring this outcome, and effects on one and on the other. Anyway, this is one of the few bits of really good news on social impacts of CDR, right? Most studies that have looked at CDR, community-driven reconstruction or community-driven development, have found very few impacts on social outcomes, right? So this was sort of striking. About 2 years later, there was a massive scale-up, and this scale-up was in East Congo. Here we had 83 villages playing. Here we had 1,000 villages, nearly 2 million people involved in this. Sort of a huge intervention, introducing CDR in communities, and then looking at impacts using these very strong behavioural measures of CDR on social outcomes. And across something like 200 measures, the distribution of T-stats followed a T-distribution, right? Which means that this was as if nothing happened. It was, if we gave you the data and said which one was treatment and which one was control, there's nothing in the data to tell you which one. In fact, we checked so often to see if we'd accidentally randomized the data, because we did randomize the data in order to do our mock analysis. But so there's this one line of code at the top saying randomize the data. We checked that it was gone 100 times. So here's an example of this is one of the families of measures of capture. They all sort of look like this. Most of them are these, all center around zero, quite small effects, and many of them tend in sort of the opposite direction. But overall, it's basically a T-distribution. So this is really worrying. So one question here we have is, well, can we go deeper and understand, rather than just looking, it's so frustrating looking at these average effects here and average effects here, the positive here and the negative here, what's really going on. So can we go deeper? So in the Liberia case, what what we've been working on right now, we've come back to this data and said, let's try and do some structural estimation. Instead of thinking of this as a problem of average treatment effects, can we think of this as a problem of parameter estimation? Okay. So what we've been doing is we've been working with a sort of a simple model of what are the choices people are making in these communities when they're making contributions. Right. So here, when they make contributions, it affects what project comes to the village. They may have a coordination concern. They may want to be people who are contributing similar to others in their communities, right? So that's the strategic component. They may be concerned about being punished, if they fail to cooperate. And they have some intrinsic motivations where they feel it's good to be contributing, even independent of the effects that it has on the public good, right? So it's a group activity and so on. So, that fairly simple formulation, we put down a particular functional form for this. We've got additive separability here. We're making some assumptions and taking out a set of parameters. But we can identify this with data we have. So we have data on people's expectations. We have data on people's beliefs that they can be observed when they take actions and so on. And so we can go about doing that. We can also, and this is where things get a bit fuzzy, we can also start making much stronger theoretical assumptions, right? So this is a game. Given that if we believe that utility function has an equilibrium, right, which means that we can figure out what people's expectations should be given the fundamental parameters if we believe those parameters, which means we can do what I'd like to call a kind of qualitative analysis. So in each area we've got multiple bits of data. In particular, we've got what people do and what they believe. And any statement about the parameters should have implications for both of those things. So in principle, if we use this claim, this sort of equilibrium claim about the expectation, about how people form their expectations, we should be able to get better estimates, right? Because we're getting more information on these same parameters. Okay, so we estimate this using a hierarchical Bayesian model, which is so this is done using STAN. It's a very flexible way of estimating this kind of thing, allowing for a lot of village heterogeneity and so on. And so to give it just a sense of the sort of things we're finding here, so the alpha term is the extent to which people get an intrinsic value out of participation, right? That's independent of the impacts on the public good, and it's independent of the impacts via sanctioning and this kind of thing. What we're seeing here is that women's intrinsic value is higher when they're playing with other women than when they're playing in mixed groups. Right? They're putting a stronger intrinsic value on contributing. And the CDR intervention, if anything, is weakening that intrinsic valuation. And also surprisingly, those two effects, the homogeneity effect and the CDR effect, are both kind of independent in the parameter space. Right? So if you remember in the raw data, this very strong interactive effect, this strong heterogeneity. There's actually homogeneity in the parameter space across of the treatment effects on these things. In contrast, so the gains in the women's groups is coming through this alpha parameter. It's coming through this intrinsic parameter. In contrast, the CDR gains are coming through the parameters on expectations. So it's their beliefs about the expectations of others, right? Which is actually consistent with our original findings, is that in those areas in which people took part in this community-driven reconstruction, people have got a much stronger sense of the actions of others. There's more sort of coordination, there's more organization, right? We're not seeing a change in the fundamental parameters, but we are seeing a change in the effectiveness of coordination. So this is quite interesting. It's not just that they're heterogeneous effects. This works this way here and this way here. But we're seeing different sorts of mechanisms and sort of plausible mechanisms through which the two sorts of treatments are working. Okay, so some conclusions here. First of all, the conclusions, are much more interesting. We find it much more interesting to get a sense of what is the data generating process that gives rise to this, rather than just what is the overall effects. There's something we've been a bit worried about, which is we're looking at the effects on deep parameters in a way, and some people often define deep parameters as those things that you don't have effects on. Those are things that are sort of fixed. So in a way, there's kind of a turtles all the way down problem here. We can formally think of deep parameters as having an index, based on some other contextual features. So okay, and the second is it's really model dependent, right? So we really have to have a lot of faith in the structure of this model to believe this. And what when we mess with the model, or when we introduce the expectations, we see quite a bit of variation. Right, at least in the work we've been doing so far. So, that leaves you more queasy. You can give sort of model-dependent answers, but you don't have the nice defensible results you get from design-based inference, which lets you say, I've got no idea what's going on, but here's the effect. Okay, how far trust the model? Okay. The third approach, which we're looking at, is kind of structured meta analysis. So our motivation here was we did this project in Uganda again, where we produced this thing called the Uganda MP scorecard together with a group called AFLI. The scorecard had lots of information about the performance of politicians. Do they turn up to Parliament? Do they, what do they vote on? Are they in their constituencies? A whole lot of information about politicians. And this took place over 4 years. There were actually 4 of these cards done over the course of a term in office, right? And half of the MPs in Uganda were randomly signed into this process where there would be this dissemination of the scorecards around the constituencies, and half weren't. So it was a large-scale sort of national experiment, bringing political information about performance to populations. We did this sort of, calling it here a survey experiment, but we did a first sort of experiment where we provided individuals sort of directly with information about the politicians, right? So this is similar to what we did with the communication, sort of one-on-one delivery of this information. And we find these very beautiful, tight results. So this is a graph of the heterogeneous effects where we break people down based on whether they supported the MP before or not, and whether the MP was actually doing well or not, right? And what you see is that if you're not a past supporter, but you got an MP that's in the top 25%, you got a 25% increase in your claimed likelihood to support this MP, right? So huge effect, right? But it runs, that goes down exactly the way it's expected to go down. So if you're a past supporter and you thought the guy was great, but actually getting information that he or she's been performing fairly poorly, there's a big drop in support. Right? So we have these very strong sort of results, as you might expect, in this sort of controlled setting, which has advantages that you know about delivery, that they've got it and so on, but you're worried about desirability bias and all these other sorts of things. Okay? So then we scale up nationally and have these workshops throughout the country in which MPs come and they defend their record and this kind of thing, which opens up the possibilities for the MPs to say, these scorecards are a load of rubbish. In fact, I wasn't there because I was doing this, which is better for you. Allows for the possibility of these to enter a political process, the way they should enter a political process, right? That's the field part of this, right? And so across the board, you don't get closer to zero than this, the sort of, so zero going on here. And then we also look at, on the other side, at MP performance. So half of these MPs are being dogged by the constituents who've got this information, right? And they can alter their behaviour. Like, I can get a better score if I turn up to Parliament, right? In fact, once the Speaker of the House in Parliament, when there weren't many people there, he said, you guys have to show up because the scorecard is watching you, right? There's a sort of knowledge of this being a concern. Here is a graph of the treatment and control MPs over time, with sort of showing the bumps also when the scorecard was released publicly, the fanfare in the media and these things. And so nothing here either. So nothing going on at scale, despite some encouraging stuff in the more controlled experimentation. I'd also say that this is an area where this is a very simple proposition. There's nothing really theoretically complex or subtle about this. It's about as simple as you get. And there has been some mixed evidence on this proposition. So I think possibly the strongest positive evidence is the Ferraz and Finan results from Brazil, which is very striking results about the impact of information and corruption audits on voting, which was really quite strong. So with this group, Evidence and Governance and Politics, which is sort of a network of experimentalists working in both economists and political scientists, but largely political scientists, we put together this sort of coordinated set of 7 projects that are sort of happening simultaneously, assessing this sort of logic. There's common interventions, plus individual researchers have their own arms because they want to be able to publish their own stuff and say this is their original in this area, but there's a common core intervention. There's a common measurement strategy down to the wording of particular items or the way particular items are being addressed. There's a common as well as a separate pre-registration, right? So there's a pre-registration of the meta-analysis that's going to be done across all the 7 studies. And there's coordinated sort of ex-ante third-party replication. So each study that comes in, they provide to the set of people the data and their code, but actually the code is reproduced for validity. Okay, so 70 studies. They're now all completed. So what did we find? Not telling you yet. So more clickbait. Sorry about that. So I'm not telling you yet for a very good reason. We want to learn about what is the effect of learning from studies, right? So Richard is here, was very instrumental in Sedlmeier in getting this going. We want to set up an experiment in which, when these results are back, we expose people to, first of all, figure out what are their priors and the effects of these things. Unfortunately, you've seen our study. Well, that's fine. That's already prehistory. And then we expose people to different results from these 7 studies, right? So some people will see these 5, some people will see these 5, some people will see another 5, and so on. And then we figure out how people are updating their beliefs about the remaining studies, given what they've seen. So the question is, can we actually answer this question about what we're learning from these studies, and are we learning the right things, right? So it's possible that the heterogeneity is so great that when you have small samples, you actually make false inferences, with very high frequency. That's possible. And one thing we also want to do is compare the human learning to sort of what you get from some sort of machine learning on this very sort of small data, but something you get from sort of like a Bayesian hierarchical model. Okay. So we'd love you to take part. There's going to be a sort of policy sort of thing where we get a set of people together to do this in person. We also want to put in place sort of an online platform where if you put on the headphones and sit for maybe an hour and a half, it could be quite long to get all of these. But you know what you're doing to get all of these treatments, and we want to hear people's responses. Okay. So EGAP is calling these integrated studies metaketas. Thanks to Diffid and others, there are now about 4 of these going on. And there have also been things going on by IPA, and Chris Blattman has got one going on with conditional cash transfers and so on, looking at the same thing in lots of places. So I'm very excited about those. We'll see what we find, but I'm also conscious that they also have real limitations. And so the 2 biggest limitations probably are, at the level of context, 7 is a small number, right? I mean, getting 7 studies together is amazing in this area. But you don't get a lot of power with 7 studies, right? So there's still, it's going to be any estimates of this heterogeneity at that level. It's going to be very noisy, and we've sort of specified the structure of heterogeneity we're looking for, right? So are the effects weaker in less competitive electoral environments than strong electoral environments? We put some sort of structure in those, which are consistent with theoretical accounts. But whenever you're doing heterogeneous effects, you're doing what's called implicit mediation analysis, right? You're not actually doing mediation analysis. We're not identifying effects via particular mediators in order to pin down the full causal story. So it offers less than the structured approach, but it's less risky. And I also think it's less risky there's lower risks of spurious results entering the literature, I hope. Okay. So, some last words. So, there's been pressure on evidence for a while, certainly for the last 10 years. It seems to me this pressure is set to continue, and the stakes are going to be higher. In the US, aid itself is facing large cuts, but social science is also likely to be facing cuts. Some responses, some of the responses we need might be in terms of methods, right? So things like proper interpretation of nulls, resist the desire to say that when you have a null effect that now there's no effect, which is often not justified by the null. Connection to, I think we need to work more on connecting our findings to actual Bayesian decision making. So on these 2 points, my sense is these these were both issues quite prominently in all this discussion around worms, which people might have seen. Whatever your belief about how strong the worms effects were, the question about whether you should do deworming or not, has to be influenced by the tiny cost of deworming sort of interventions. And so there's this complete disconnect between the sort of the evidence assessment and the sort of conclusions that can be formed, which partly made that discussion, both in the academic and policy sphere, a very, very messy and dissatisfying one, in my view at least. But there are also some responses in terms of communities of research. So one of these is keeping each other honest, and so these sorts of networks like you have here, CSAE and other networks are very important for this. But I would really, people worry about some aspects of pre-registration, but pre-registration is playing a huge role practically for us in keeping each other honest, keeping ourselves conscious of the choices we're making when we're doing analysis, what is ex post and what is ex ante. And work more on coordinated research agendas. There's such a tendency for everyone, and there's partly professional incentives to be doing completely unique projects, which leads to almost no comparability and enormous heterogeneity. I think there's a collective action component to that, but I think we need to, as a community, sort of bite the bullet and go for a little less innovation, a little bit more reliability. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. We still have about 10 minutes for questions behind you and then in front. Yeah.
I want to ask, this Jeremy Foltz, University of Wisconsin, I want to ask about what seems to be a bit of a contradiction. You're talking about pre-registration as a really good thing, and I can see lots of great things about that. We're all sinners, and therefore we need to pre-register before we sin again. But you're also telling us that this is a Bayesian decision-making process. And it seems like those are actually completely different things. And that if we are pre-registering, then we are actually throwing out a lot of data that could be useful for our Bayesian decision-making.
Okay, thank you. There at the back for a moment, and then we'll come here. Yeah.
Charles Archer from University of Bonn. Back also on the pre-registration, I think it's still not enough because we have seen studies that have been pre-specified or pre-registered, and they have shown hundreds of estimation strategies and several pathways. So people can also abuse the pre-registration. And the second part also I want to talk about is the role of journals. And you are talking about building reputation. And we have seen that in the top journals, the same people are publishing in that journals, leaving out newcomers. So it's more or less same group of people publishing in the same journals all over again, and being abused. And that is what I was
Okay, and then here, question.
Fayassan from Trinity College Dublin. Very quick question on when you were showing what was happening in your experiments. So they work at the micro level, but once you scale it up, they do not work. And this raises a question between micro and macro linkages in development, and how useful are micro projects for macro policies. In a sense, it goes back to the role of economists as a plumber, to put it into flow words recently. So
right. Okay. Why don't you take your Macartan?
Yeah. Okay. Good. So these are great questions. I don't see a contradiction between pre-registration and Bayesian analysis at all. In fact, I would say as a Bayesian, when you do pre-registration, you're providing information that can be of critical importance for later evaluating the results itself. So in our paper on pre-registration, we actually go through the sort of the Bayesian exercise of what inferences you make conditional upon pre-registration having happened or not. The sort of first comment, but also I'd say there's people. I think one of the problems of the way pre-registration has been done at the moment is people think very much in terms of this is for classical statistics, and it's particularly for hypothesis testing of some form. But the fishing problem is kind of a generic problem. It can happen just with measurement. It can happen with, you can do Bayesian estimation and do fishing with your priors or whatever else, or your models and so on. So the fundamental problem exists both for Bayesian and for classical. And then the last comment on that is the throwing away of information My view, not everyone agrees on this, but my view is the primary gain from pre-registration is the communication of intent, and it's not the binding of hands, right? And that if you have information that you got after the fact that tells you you should do the analysis differently, you should do the analysis differently, but also report what you would have found had you not found the analysis differently, so that people can make that inference, right? I just note as a worry there was a study done of pre-registration medical journals, and they assessed people, the people who altered their strategy from their pre-registered strategy. And I think in something like 19 out of 20 cases, that alteration all led to something being non-significant turning to significant, not the opposite direction. So you might worry about that, but you have the information to do that inference. I completely agree in terms. I didn't expect this to be about pre-registration, but I completely agree. It's not sufficient. And in fact, people sometimes confuse the multiple comparisons problem with the registration problem. And you can do pre-registration of completely awful analysis, and it doesn't protect you. But what it does do is provide the information for people to assess it. On the journals, it's a great comment. There's a lot of clubbiness among some journals. There's a sense I have, I can say this as an outsider to economics. Economics looks extraordinarily hierarchical compared to political science, and the clubbiness looks really striking. I don't know what the revolution is going to be, but it looks like there may need to be one, where you often have entire policies based on one or two papers by the people at the top of the hierarchy. What I actually said there for journals is I think there's a lot of scope for a PLOS type model. So what the PLOS type model for journals is doing is it's in principle, I think I don't know the actual numbers for this, but it's something like they have 20,000 or 30,000 articles per year, some massive number of articles. But the criterion are the credibility of the research and the research results. That's the primary criterion, rather than the innovation. And then the innovation question is a distinct question. Now, frankly, I'm not sure how that will play out, because if the innovation, that can contribute, that could make it easier to do cross-study fishing of what you want to say is an important result. But it seems right that the gatekeeping should be primarily on quality rather than on message. The micro-macro, if people have time or interest in the paper on the communication where the scale up, we see it exactly as a micro-macro sort of contradiction or lack of continuity, and we sort of try to talk through a set of mappings between those to make sense of it. But we basically, in that paper, we sort of discount we don't think it's a general equilibrium kind of thing that's going on there, which is often on people's minds.
Okay, some more questions. One stand here, then we'll come here.
Good morning, Erwin Knippenberg from Cornell University. Though I'm sympathetic to your structural argument, is there not an argument to be made for a complete non-parametric approach, exploiting new machine learning techniques to sort of strip out any prior biases the researcher will bring to the data?
Yeah. Right. Question here.
Thank you. Hisaki Kono from Kyoto University, and the structural estimation is kind of in contrast to other two approaches, because in structural estimation that we should set up functional forms which model will predict well. So will you recommend pre-registration for the structural analysis?
Yes. Okay. Any other questions? Well, there's one here, Philip.
Macartan, I liked your idea of doing research together with in 7 different places with all the same strategy, the design. But it's sometimes very difficult already to do one very good design adapted to the local context. How about that if you have the same design? Because I think that's what you want, the same design in 7 contexts. Don't we want our designs to be context specific also, to take into account the local institutional context? Yeah. I know, of course, you want also comparability, but how do you go about that in EGAP when you have 7 different, or even maybe more, because you want higher power and you want to, let's say, impose that the design has to be exactly the same so that you can learn from it? How do you trade off the two, basically?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay, these are great comments. So in terms of the sort of more machine learning approaches, we got BART approaches to looking for heterogeneity. I think this is with sort of cross-validation, these sorts of approaches. So we've used some of that in some of our work. That was actually what I was thinking of when I say, and there are more. My sense is that for kind of a standard intervention to understand the heterogeneity, they're very powerful, particularly if the cross-validation is done seriously. So there's really, out-of-sample testing. I think that people might have two concerns. One is a sort of an intellectual concern about, do you really understand, the story, the causal process, and what is our goal. From a development perspective, I'd be less worried about that. I'd be more worried if around the difficulty in answering a question. I guess it's related, but if the question is, okay, so now we understand how this works in this context, but what if we did something different? Right, so what we want to know is about a different intervention, which sort of requires that we've got stronger theoretical knowledge. And so that gap is still large when you do cross-validation. But for more sort of homogeneous generic treatments, I think it sounds like it's a strong approach. As we were doing this, and I'm very new to the structural estimation. I haven't really, this is my first time really trying it. I think I was pretty amazed at it's not surprising after the fact that the degrees of freedom are massive, in structural estimation, more than I had realized, which, I think puts a premium on pre-registration. There's more gains for it here. I also know there's no way we could have pre-registered this, insofar as it really has a feel of exploratory sort of work. With other approaches, maybe it's more fruitful to see this in stages. So that there's exploratory modeling, there's greater confidence over theories, and so on, and then you do your more sort of testing style structural estimation. With pre-registration. Okay, last comment, Philip, on, DFID actually, maybe this is your fault, Stefan, but DFID has been very interested in sort of adaptive learning, which I've been trying to figure out what it is, but it sort of has the notion that you tailor things a lot to context and you modify as you go ahead, and there are real, obvious risks to doing that. And so one of the risks is that you cut. I'm not actually blaming you for this. You should. But one of the risks is that you cut studies, you move on too early, right? But there's sort of a deeper problem that you're letting places self-select into the treatment that's being looked at, right? And in political contexts, that could be terrible. So you could imagine two interventions. Either of which would be effective in one or other context, and locally people know which one is going to undermine them politically, right? And so they select into the intervention that's going to have no political impact on them in all places. And the effect of the tailoring means that you learn really strictly nothing about how things work. So it seems to be the goal really needs to be, obviously the measurement has to make sense in the context. You have to be adaptive to the situation for on that side. But on the treatment side, you're taking, I think, tremendous risks when you tailor too much.
Okay, so I'm going to take one or two more questions, and I have one final one. Is anyone dying for a question there? Let's take the last one, and I have a question for you as well. And I will close and see your last statement.
Okay, thanks for a great presentation. So I just wanted to, and correct me if I'm wrong, there seems to be an implicit assumption that not only that there is always a clean mechanism leading up to the effect that we observe, but that mechanism might also be unique and applicable to other places. Could you reflect a little on that? Is it possible that you have an experiment, you have a clean mechanism in one place, but then maybe there are multiple mechanisms leading up to the same effect, and in that case, even with a clean model that works very well in that specific context, there is little room for you to work in another context?
Right, and I just want to make a few comments and then to close, and then Macartan, if you can answer that, and maybe then one more question here. I mean, I think you're absolutely right in saying that we should be conscious that in terms of money, maybe some of our glory days are a little bit over. There's going to be a little bit less money around for research. I think the political climate in lots of places is like that. So it does mean we have to be a bit more careful with how we use it. I take away definitely your point and I like your point on our obsession with outliers. I mean, it is something that I think economics still is somewhat less mature than a lot of other disciplines. That we are definitely known and clearly shown our pettiness all the time. You know, the idea of shared scientific progress is not something that is actually ever existing in economics, even in development. The default is always about finding weakness rather than looking for strength and moving forward. And an obsession with asking trivial questions. Also a kind of a total lack of respect, which you're alluding to, for actually synthesis, meta-analysis, you know, what does it actually add up to? What does it actually bring together? So that's a great thing. So cooperation is clearly one of these answers here. But one thing, though, and the kind of things you've been doing, you know, they cost a fortune. And you allude to clubbiness and so on. What are the risks here of emerging monopoly powers in research? And how do groups like yours that you're engaged in make sure that these markets remain contestable and people can enter? Okay. Now finish on that one.
Okay, so can I go? So on the question, first of all, of unique mechanisms, so this is where I was referring earlier to the work of Judea Pearl, which is sort of trying to frame these kinds of causal questions in terms of networks, you know, causal networks. I think it's a very powerful way to think about the processes we care about. You know, too often we're just really thinking about sort of single equation situations, and it allows huge flexibility. My sense is, insofar as possible, our estimands, you know, should be the structure of a network, you know, rather than average causal effect. We should be trying to understand the structure of network. So that's to say is, I would make absolutely no presumption of a single unique mechanism. And in a way, if there's a unique mechanism, you know, the mediation problem is a trivial sort of problem. It only becomes an interesting problem or important problem when there's multiple mechanisms. With that said, the idea of unique mechanism is almost hardwired into the way that some evaluation research is done. So sometimes you'll get grants and they'll say, please specify your theory of change. And by a theory of change, they mean precisely the line of A causes B causes C causes D to an outcome, which is almost inconsistent with every model we have of how the world works. You know, given that we know, you know, from fundamental work on causality that cause relationships aren't transitive, you know, you're getting off to a bad start when you're assuming that, you know, this sort of line will follow. So worries there if that's really affecting the way you're doing research. So two responses to Stefan. Well, first of all, I wanted to say, I guess for people to mull over, the part of all this that I'm really deeply, you know, uncertain about is that it is quite possible that if we try to become more credible in these kinds of ways, the research will become more null and more uninteresting. And the response from funders and everyone else is to say, well, to hell with that for a game of cowboys. You know, we're not going to support this, you know, this stuff anymore. So while I feel these sorts of directions are intellectually the right way to go, and they might end up with stronger defenses with some communities, they also could create real risks of exposure. So I don't know the answer to that. So in terms of the expense and so on, I'd say two things. I mean, one thing. In terms of the EGEP network, when it has these calls, actually the PI, this is contrary, you know, not all groups work at this, but our PIs who raise the funding recuse themselves from getting the grants for doing the research. They're entirely open calls, which are based just on merit, not whether you have published in various places in your CV and those things. And I think that's obvious, but that's not how it's done everywhere. In terms of the expense, maybe we have to rethink this funding, this sort of the funding model. I mean, in a way, the best research often is research that's in which the outcome variables are based on, actually Philip was talking about yesterday, on administrative data, on data that's collected anyway. So in our areas, whether people turn out and whether they vote and these kinds of things, but in other areas, whether if you can use administrative data, which if you can use that, there's in a way they're more, in some ways more believable, but they're collected anyway. And in a way, the best, most credible interventions are the interventions that are very similar, that are done by the people who'd be doing them anyway. So on the intervention side, they could be. So, when the first field experiments I did was free. It was a national scale intervention, but it just involves a manipulation of how things were done at a national level, and then administrative data. But one thing I think people might think of, and maybe Diffit and others could think of models to use this, is to generate what you might think of as a kind of an experiment pack, or module or something. So here's something with a set of instructions and a web form or something to submit data to, that any teacher anywhere, like we were talking about migration yesterday, any teacher that's got a mixed classroom, you can say refugee or migrant, non-migrant classroom. This is as an example. Here's instructions for how in your classroom you might have a contact experiment, right, based on your seating order. And if you want to take part in this, have a consent process and have a way to register the data, and think about building in sort of verification sorts of schemes, so that you can crowdsource a large-scale data on some sort of core feature that you care about. We don't have anything, as far as I know, things like that, but we can imagine them in lots of our areas.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Macartan. We've eaten in the coffee break.